This is my third opening to the online History of Psychology course that I'm creating, and the previous two openings came from History of Mesmerism and the history inscribed by Edna Heidbreder, her 7 psychologies. And now, as a third opening, I want to talk about the history of a discipline of judgment and decision making. And that history comes to us through Leroy Beach, who writes and inscribes part of that history in his book, A New Theory of Mind, the Theory of Narrative Thought. And he writes this with Byron Bissell and Jim Wise, his first graduate student at Washington, who writes some erudite commentaries to the chapters in Lee's book, and one of those chapters concerns the history of the subject. So I'll mention a little bit about this theory in passing. This is Lee's picture. He was at Washington for a long time and wound up at Arizona and retired from there. And their book was published back in 2016. The book also has as its main purpose the description of a theory of narrative thought, which is a more contemporary theory that arose in the late 1970s in something called image theory and evolved into a much more complex theory. The narratives we construct, for instance, to aid in the choices that we make, are subserved by 6 or 7 different cognitive systems, including visual perception, episodic memory, or what we call explicit memory, memory with consciousness, and also the limbic system, emotions. So Lee, as Lee says in his book, the narratives we form that help to guide our decisions and our choices are laced with emotion. And decision theorists know about how emotion is involved in choice, particularly with regard to loss and prospective losses. So I'm going to include Lee's theory in a segment from the course I call Psychology of the 1970s, because it was in its embryonic form by the late 1970s and certainly by 1980. And I'm going to draw from his book a bit of history on the origins of decision theory. And so I'll relate a little bit of that here now in this opening. And Lee describes the early work of Blaise Pascal, who was a genius-level inventor and mathematician and probabilist, probability theorist, born 1623 in France. He invented, among other things, a mechanical calculator that could add and subtract. He invented the syringe, the hydraulic press, which was designed to amplify force. And he did important work on the basics of probability, and as well principles of hydraulics and vacuums. He formulated a famous argument for choosing to believe in God. And according to Lee, this is one that neatly summarizes risky decisions. And so I'll open with this. And we'll also say that Pascal was one in a long line of mathematicians that include Bernoulli and von Neumann, John von Neumann of Princeton, in by the middle of the last century, and furthering this field of decision making. But Pascal's origins, Pascal's initial formulation of a decision is worth mentioning. And Lee describes this in as part of his history. So we have a choice, all of us who are born and live in this world, to whether or not to believe in God. So our choice is to believe or not to believe in God. And Pascal tried to inform what might be a better choice in this realm based on a sort of a formal analysis. So he imagined two outcomes: one that God exists, and the other that God doesn't exist. And in relation to the choice to believe or not to believe, Pascal imagined these outcomes and their valuations, and that's important. Outcomes and their valuations are factored into many of the decisions that we make. So, for instance, in choosing the option to believe in God during one's lifetime, we're all offered that option as a choice. If, as an outcome, God exists, then your payoff is heaven, is an eternity spent in heaven. If, on the other hand, God doesn't exist, then you have incurred a cost of time and energy and effort through prayer, for instance, through devotion, through offerings in the church pews or synagogues in which you worship, and so you've lost something as a result, and that loss can have a valuation attached. However, heaven has a very strong positive valence to it. And one assumption I should mention in this characterization by Pascal is that the knowledge will not occur about whether or not God exists until Judgment Day. So we don't know for sure until after we're dead. Okay. Now the second option, option B, is to not believe in God. And some of us make this choice in the course of our lifetimes. However, there are possible outcomes that can be characterized there as well. And one of them, if God exists, is that we may experience hell for all eternity. And that's a pretty steep loss if you've made the wrong choice, which you can't know until the day of your departure from Earth. Okay. However, if in fact, if the outcome occurs that God doesn't exist, there's no loss. You haven't invested anything in terms of prayer, in terms of devotion, lighting candles, etc. However, Pascal looked at this and he determined there was a better choice, and he did so by way of the cost, the extreme cost of hell, experiencing hell. And he decided that the valence, or the valuation of that outcome was so great that it counsels a person who lives on earth to invest the time in believing in God. And that was his analysis, a famous analysis that Pascal pursued about belief in God. So you could say the roots of decision making have their origins in a bet on the existence of God. And here we have the face of a more contemporary theorist, John von Neumann, who formalized a lot of this and in something called expected utility theory and subjective expected utility theory. Bernoulli, the mathematician, had the insight that the valuations we place on outcomes are very oftentimes subjective valuations. And von Neumann and his colleague Morgenstern published a famous book on decision making back in the 40s that formalized this whole process of expected utility. And this becomes part of the latter history of decision making and decision theory. It's also a history that Edna Heidbreder doesn't include in her 1933 work on seven psychologies, one of our main sources in this course, because Heidbreder, this von Neumann's theory didn't roll out until the mid-40s. And von Neumann was a very interesting guy. He was from Budapest, and from a very culturally astute family. They used to have lots of dinners at their apartment, and lots of stimulation, and the culture of his family life is one of the things that one of his biographers believed made him so intelligent and so prolific. And he, as his colleague here says, in the caption of this photo, he seemed to always be willing to go where the action was. And von Neumann had his hand in everything back in the 40s and 50s. He, for one, was involved in designing triggering devices for nuclear bombs. He worked with the military and had contracts and grants from the military. Von Neumann was at Princeton and for a long time, and he also had much to do, in fact, with the development of the digital computer, and was using the computers in simulating weather and predicting weather way back then, 50, 60 years ago. So using the power of digital computing to predict weather, and they actually had some very positive results. But von Neumann, like many other decision theorists, was very interested in the valuation of a bet, so seeing a choice as a bet. And this formalization is something that become parts of modern day theories, although if we look at Leroy Beach's theory, narrative thought, a more contemporary theory, we find that it is much more cognitive in its inputs. It very much integrates the cognitive psychology that arose during the late 50s and 60s and developed for the last half century. So Lee's is a much more contemporary, much more contextualized and textured theory about how cognitive processes are involved in forming narratives that aren't exclusively bets, and that don't formalize this process of betting so as to afford us the opportunity to make choices. And we'll talk more about that in the history of 70s psychology. So there's my third opening: history of mesmerism, history of 7 psychologies as inscribed by Ed Heidbreder, and a little bit on the origins and roots of decision theory as told by Leroy Beach in his book that I have used, and in my own teaching, A New Theory of Mind.